There is a death investigation at a home in Brentwood on Chadbourne Avenue. Right now, we do know that there are two victims. We're told a 78-year-old man and a 68-year-old woman. The LAPD homicide unit is on this.
At first, nothing felt wrong. The house stood quietly on a clean Brentwood street, exactly where it had always been. No shattered glass, no splintered doors, no sign that anything violent had forced its way inside. For investigators, that calm was immediately unsettling. Inside, the space felt paused rather than destroyed. Furniture sat neatly in place. A jacket rested over a chair, shoes waited by the entryway, everyday objects frozen mid-routine. There was no mess to explain panic, no overturned items to suggest a fight. Light filtered naturally through the windows, soft and ordinary, as if the house expected its owners to return later that evening. In cases like this, chaos usually speaks first. Broken things tell stories. Damage leaves timelines. But here, silence did all the talking. The absence of disorder became the loudest clue in the room. The kitchen offered nothing helpful. Counters were clear, drawers were closed, the refrigerator hummed quietly, indifferent to what had already happened. Calendars still pointed forward. Plans remained uncanceled. Upstairs, bedrooms looked untouched. Beds were made, lights were off. The rooms didn't feel abandoned. They felt temporarily empty, like someone had simply stepped away. That illusion didn't last long. Investigators knew what they were looking at. A home that hadn't been interrupted by force. A space that showed no signs of fear or escape. Whatever happened here didn't explode into the room. It unfolded quietly, without warning. Outside, the neighborhood carried on. Cars passed, trees moved in the breeze. Neighbors would later say they heard nothing. No shouting, no struggle, no sudden noise that might have drawn attention before it was too late. That calm became part of the mystery. In a city where sounds travel fast, this house stayed silent. Every detail was documented with care, because when nothing looks wrong, even the smallest inconsistency matters. No forced entry meant no obvious intruder. No disorder meant no visible resistance. The scene didn't suggest chaos, it suggested control, or something that looked like it. For a home belonging to Rob Reiner, a man whose life unfolded loudly on screens and stages, the stillness was almost cruel. The house didn't match the gravity of what investigators already knew, and that mismatch raised a terrifying question. If nothing was broken, if no one forced their way in, then whoever did this didn't come as a stranger. And that realization shifted the investigation in a direction no family ever expects. When the initial shock wore off, investigators focused on what wasn't there. No broken locks, no damaged doors, no shattered windows. In a case involving two deaths, that absence narrowed the field fast. Whatever happened inside the house did not begin with someone forcing their way in. Police confirmed the weapon was a knife. That detail mattered. A blade requires proximity. It isn't distant or impersonal. It demands closeness, timing, and control. And in a home where nothing appeared disturbed, that raised an uncomfortable possibility. This wasn't a sudden ambush. It was something that unfolded without resistance, or at least without chaos. Robbery was quickly ruled out. Valuables remained in place. Nothing suggested someone was searching for money or items to take. The house hadn't been ransacked. It hadn't even been disturbed. Investigators weren't looking at a crime driven by opportunity. They were looking at something deliberate. That realization shifted the tone of the investigation almost immediately. This wasn't about tracking an unknown intruder through the neighborhood. It was about understanding who already had access, who could walk in without raising alarm, who wouldn't need to break anything to get inside. The case was transferred to the Los Angeles Police Department's homicide unit, and with that came a change in focus. Interviews centered on family, close contacts, and anyone who knew the house well. The timeline became personal. The questions became harder. In situations like this, detectives look for tension before the moment everything stopped. Arguments, unresolved conflicts, emotional pressure that had nowhere left to go. Because when a crime leaves no physical chaos behind, it often points to something that had been building quietly for a long time. The house didn't show signs of panic. That suggested familiarity, comfort, or trust. And trust, investigators know, can be the most dangerous thing to misplace. By the end of the first day, the direction was clear. This wasn't about a stranger slipping in unseen. It was about someone already inside the circle, someone close enough that the house never had a chance to warn anyone at all. And within hours, attention turned toward a person no one wanted to suspect, but couldn't ignore. The shift happened quietly, but its impact was explosive. As investigators narrowed their focus, one name began to surface again and again, not from rumors, not from tabloids, but from timelines, access, and proximity. Within hours, the case took a turn that stunned even seasoned detectives. Police took Nick Reiner into custody, 32 years old, the son of the two people found dead inside that untouched home. The idea alone was enough to stop the story cold. This wasn't a suspect from the shadows. This was flesh and blood. He was booked on suspicion of murder. Bail was initially discussed, then swiftly revoked. He would be held without bail. That detail spoke volumes. Whatever investigators had uncovered in those early hours was serious enough to convince the court that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a tragic accident. The evidence pointed inward, and it pointed hard. For the public, the shock came in waves. First, the deaths. Then the confirmation that it wasn't natural. Then the revelation that there was no break-in. And now this. The story had gone from mysterious to deeply personal in less than a day. Hollywood watched in disbelief. This was a family known for decades, a household associated with creativity, activism, and success. The idea that such a private collapse could end in public horror felt almost unreal. But the facts didn't flinch. Investigators didn't frame this as a sudden snap or an isolated moment. They began digging backward, into years, not hours, into relationships, not just movements. Because cases like this are rarely born overnight. They are usually the end of something long unresolved. As cameras gathered outside the Brentwood home and headlines spread worldwide, one truth became unavoidable. This tragedy wasn't about a random act of violence. It was about a family history that had been quietly unraveling for years. And once that history came into focus, the story grew far darker than anyone expected. To understand how the investigation reached this point, detectives had to step far beyond the events of that afternoon. They began examining a history that stretched back decades, marked not by a single breaking moment, but by years of strain that never fully healed. Nick Reiner's life had long been defined by instability. From an early age, he struggled with harmful substances, a battle that pulled him in and out of treatment centers again and again. By his early 20s, he had cycled through more facilities than most people could count. Each attempt brought hope. Each relapse reopened old wounds. The struggle didn't stay contained. It reshaped the family dynamic. There were periods of closeness followed by long stretches of distance, times when doors were open, followed by moments when communication collapsed entirely. Friends later described a cycle of fear, exhaustion, and desperate love. Parents trying to help, unsure whether their help was saving their son or enabling his downfall. At the center of it all was a strategy many families turn to when nothing else seems to work. Tough love, boundaries, cutoffs, the belief that removing support might force recovery. But strategies like that don't just create space, they can also create resentment. And resentment, left alone long enough, has a way of fermenting. Nick would later speak publicly about feeling like an outsider in his own family, of watching his siblings connect easily with their father while he struggled to be seen beyond his addiction. The weight of those feelings didn't fade with time. They hardened. There were moments of reconciliation, but they never fully erased the past. Each attempt at healing came with old memories attached. Arguments didn't just belong to the present, they carried echoes of every fight that came before. Investigators took all of this seriously, not as gossip, but as context. When violence happens without chaos, motive rarely lives in the moment. It lives in the history. And in this case, the history was heavy, complicated, and unresolved. What made it even more unsettling was what the family chose to do with that pain next. Instead of hiding it, they turned it into art. And in doing so, they unknowingly documented the very fractures now under investigation. Because the next chapter of this story wasn't written in police files, it was written into a movie. Years before investigators ever stepped inside the Brentwood home, the Reiner family had already exposed their deepest wounds to the world, on purpose. Not through interviews or court records, but through a film that now feels uncomfortably prophetic. In 2015, Being Charlie was released. Directed by Rob Reiner and co-written by his son Nick, the movie followed a young man spiraling through addiction while clashing with his famous, emotionally distant father. At the time, it was described as semi-autobiographical. Looking back, that label feels almost understated. The film wasn't just inspired by real life, it was shaped by it. Scenes of confrontation, resentment, and abandonment weren't imagined. They were pulled from lived experience. Rob later admitted that working on the project wasn't healing. It was brutal. Writing sessions turned into shouting matches. Old arguments resurfaced with new intensity. Nothing stayed buried. Nick, in past interviews, spoke openly about how closely the story reflected his own feelings. The father in the film is obsessed with image, more concerned with reputation than his son's survival. That portrayal wasn't accidental. It was personal. And once it was written down, it couldn't be taken back. The movie ends on a hopeful note: reconciliation, forgiveness, a sense that love ultimately wins. But that ending belonged to the screen, not to reality. Behind the scenes, the tension never fully dissolved. The film closed one chapter publicly while leaving the real conflict unresolved. For investigators, this mattered, not because movies predict crimes, but because they document emotional truths. Being Charlie became a record of resentment, disappointment, and longing that never found a clean ending, a glimpse into how deep the fracture really ran. In hindsight, the project feels like a warning no one knew how to read. A family trying to process pain through storytelling, believing that honesty might lead to healing. Instead, it preserved the conflict in permanent form. And as detectives continued piecing together the final days, another detail emerged that made the situation even more disturbing. Something that suggested the tension hadn't faded with time. It had followed them right up to the end. Before the headlines, before the police tape, Rob Reiner existed in the public imagination as something almost untouchable, a creative force whose work spanned generations without losing its warmth. His career wasn't defined by one era or one genre. It was defined by reinvention. He first became a household name in the 1970s as Meathead on All in the Family, a character so culturally loud it permanently reshaped television comedy. But that role was never his destination. It was his launchpad. Reiner wanted control of the story, not just a place inside it. That leap came in 1984 with This Is Spinal Tap. What looked like a small comedy experiment quietly rewrote film history. The movie didn't just parody rock culture. It invented the modern mockumentary. Its influence spread far beyond comedy, changing how realism and satire could coexist on screen. Then came a run that almost defies logic. Stand By Me turned childhood nostalgia into something raw and honest. The Princess Bride blended fantasy, romance, and humor into a timeless classic. When Harry Met Sally redefined the romantic comedy, setting a standard writers still chase decades later. Each film felt completely different, yet all carried the same emotional precision. Reiner didn't stop there. Misery proved he could handle claustrophobic psychological terror. A Few Good Men cemented his command of high-stakes drama, delivering one of the most quoted confrontations in cinema history. Few directors ever master one genre. Reiner mastered many, back to back. Behind the scenes, he co-founded Castle Rock Entertainment, helping launch projects that shaped television and film for years to come. His influence wasn't just creative, it was structural. He helped build the industry he worked inside. That's what made the tragedy hit so hard. The public knew a man associated with laughter, empathy, and intelligence, someone whose stories often centered on moral clarity and human connection. The idea that his life could end in silence and violence felt incompatible with everything his work represented. But the contrast was unavoidable. The same man who understood human behavior well enough to capture it on screen couldn't shield his own family from collapse. And as the investigation continued, that contradiction became impossible to ignore. Because while the world remembered the films, the next chapter of this story wasn't about art at all. It was about the values he fought for when the cameras were off. For many people, Rob Reiner's most important work didn't happen behind a camera. It happened in courtrooms, ballot boxes, and long policy meetings that never made headlines. Long after his Hollywood status was secure, he redirected his influence towards something far less glamorous and far more permanent. He believed the first years of a child's life shaped everything that followed. Instead of donating quietly, he went public and took responsibility. In the late 1990s, Rob Reiner led the campaign for California's Proposition 10, a bold initiative that taxed tobacco companies to fund early childhood education and health programs. It passed. And then he didn't walk away. He spent years overseeing its implementation, working inside the system, grinding through the details most celebrities avoid. That wasn't a one-off cause. When same-sex marriage was banned in California, Reiner didn't treat it as a political inconvenience. He treated it as a civil rights emergency. Alongside his wife, he co-founded a legal organization designed for one purpose only: to take the ban apart in federal court. They hired legal heavyweights, funded the case, and stayed involved every step of the way. What began as a state fight became a national turning point. Friends said he approached activism the same way he approached filmmaking: hands-on, stubborn, and unwilling to accept half measures. He didn't care about applause, he cared about outcomes. And over time, those outcomes changed real lives: expanded preschool access, protected land, marriage equality, and sustained pressure against political extremism. That public image, the principled fighter, the moral voice, the man willing to stand his ground, became inseparable from how the country saw him. He wasn't just a director with opinions, he was a citizen who acted on them. Which is why the reaction to his death didn't stay quiet for long. The grief was immediate, but it didn't remain unified. Because in today's America, even tragedy can become a battleground. And when the responses started pouring in, they revealed just how polarizing and powerful his voice had become. The reaction came fast and from every direction. As news spread, tributes poured in from across Hollywood and the political world, all echoing the same shock. Colleagues remembered generosity. Activists remembered conviction. Friends remembered a man who never softened his beliefs, even when it cost him comfort. But the moment didn't stay unified for long. Within hours, the tragedy was pulled into the wider culture war that Rob Reiner had spent years openly fighting. Messages of sympathy collided with rhetoric that felt jarring, even cruel. What should have been a moment of shared mourning fractured into something far uglier. One response in particular ignited outrage. Donald Trump took to social media with comments that many saw as an attack disguised as commentary, turning a family tragedy into a political statement. There was no evidence, no restraint, just accusation layered on provocation. The backlash was immediate. Figures from both parties condemned the remarks, calling them inappropriate, damn right disturbing, and beyond the bounds of basic decency. Even political opponents who had clashed with Reiner for years drew a line, insisting that this was not politics. It was a family's worst possible day. What unfolded was more than outrage. It was a reflection of how deeply divided the country had become. A double homicide had exposed not just private pain, but a national inability to pause, even in the face of death. Reiner, in life, had been a lightning rod. In death, he became one again. For many viewers, this moment redefined the story. The tragedy wasn't just about what happened inside a house in Brentwood, it was about how quickly empathy evaporated once ideology entered the frame, about how public figures are never allowed to be just human, even at the end. And yet, amid the noise, another truth resurfaced. Behind the headlines, behind the arguments, there was a partnership that has shaped everything he stood for, a relationship that changed movies, movements, and lives. To understand the full weight of this loss, you have to look at the one person who stood beside him through it all. At the center of Rob Reiner's life was a partnership that quietly shaped nearly everything he became. Michelle Singer Reiner was never just his wife. She was his collaborator, his anchor, and the person who altered the course of his work in ways audiences never realized. Their story began on the set of When Harry Met Sally. At the time, Reiner had been alone for years, and it showed in the script. The original ending was bleak. The two characters walked away from each other, unresolved. Then, Michelle entered his life. The effect was immediate and profound. Reiner later admitted that meeting her changed how he understood love itself, and he rewrote the ending. That final New Year's Eve scene, the one generations still quote, exists because he fell in love. They married just months later, in a spontaneous ceremony in Hawaii. Friends described their bond as effortless but intense, built on shared values and mutual respect. Their lives didn't run on parallel tracks, they were intertwined. Michelle worked as a photographer on his films, later becoming a producer on several projects. Creatively and personally, they moved as a unit. Off-screen, their partnership mattered even more. Michelle was a driving force behind the causes they championed together, from civil rights to early childhood education. Reiner was often the public voice, but those close to them said Michelle was the strategist, the conscience, the one who pushed ideas forward when the work became exhausting. Their activism wasn't performative, it was shared purpose. They raised the family together, navigating fame, pressure, and private struggle inside a relationship that endured for decades. Even as parts of their family life fractured under strain, their marriage remained steady. Friends saw them as inseparable, two people who faced the world side by side. That's what made the ending so devastating. Their lives didn't just intersect in death, they ended together, in the same place, at the same moment. A partnership that had shaped films, laws, and movements was cut off without warning. The house in Brentwood still stands. The films still play. The laws they helped change remain in effect, but the presence that powered all of it is gone. What's left is a silence that no success, no legacy, and no public tribute can fully explain. And that may be the most unsettling truth of all. When the investigation moved on and the cameras finally pulled away, the house was left exactly as it had been. Still standing, still calm, still blending into the neighborhood like nothing extraordinary had ever happened inside. That may be the most disturbing part of all. There was no warning, no visible descent into chaos, no moment where the danger announced itself. What unfolded in that home didn't arrive loudly. It arrived through familiarity, history, and wounds that never fully closed. A lifetime of love, success, conflict, and pain collapsed into a single, irreversible moment. For the public, the story will always feel unreal. A legendary career, a powerful marriage, a family known to millions, ending not with applause or reflection, but with police tape and unanswered questions. It forces an uncomfortable realization. Status doesn't protect families. Talent doesn't heal trauma, and silence can hide the deepest fractures. This wasn't just a Hollywood tragedy. It was a reminder that the most devastating endings don't always come from strangers in the dark. Sometimes they come from inside the circle, from conflicts everyone hoped would resolve someday, from pain that stayed just beneath the surface for far too long. The films remain. The causes he fought for still exist. The impact on culture and law can't be erased. But none of that changes what happened behind those closed doors. A story that began with laughter and purpose ended without resolution. And maybe that's why this case lingers. Because the house didn't warn anyone. Because the ending didn't make sense. And because some tragedies don't offer closure, only the haunting knowledge that everything looked normal right up until it wasn't. Long after the headlines fade, this story refuses to settle. Not because of fame, not because of politics, but because it exposes something deeply uncomfortable. How easily pain can hide behind success, structure, and silence. From the outside, everything looked intact. A respected name, a long marriage, a life filled with meaning and achievement. Yet inside, unresolved conflict kept breathing, quietly, for years. No alarms, no visible cracks, just pressure building where no one could see it. That's why this case lingers in the public mind. It doesn't offer a clean lesson or a satisfying explanation. It forces people to confront a truth they'd rather avoid, that families can break even while appearing whole, and that love doesn't always conquer damage left untreated. For some, the story becomes a warning. For others, a tragedy without villains, only consequences. And for many, it's a reminder that the most dangerous moments don't always look dangerous at all. The house still exists, the legacy still matters, but the silence left behind is permanent. And maybe that's the final unsettling takeaway. Not every story ends with answers. Some end by asking a question that never fully goes away. If stories like this matter to you, the ones that dig beneath headlines and into the human cost, there are more waiting to be told. In the end, this story leaves us with something heavier than shock or grief. It leaves a question that doesn't resolve neatly, no matter how much time passes. How can a life so visible, so examined, still hide fractures deep enough to end like this? The details will be debated. The investigation will move forward. Legal steps will follow their course. But none of that fully explains the silence inside that house, or why the warning signs never reached the outside world in time. What happened in Brentwood wasn't just the collapse of a famous family. It was a reminder that pain doesn't need darkness to grow. It can exist in bright rooms, behind success, behind smiles that convince everyone, including the people closest, that things will eventually be okay. That's why stories like this matter. Not because they involve recognizable names, but because they expose the space between how life looks and how it's actually lived. The gap where unresolved conflict waits. The place where hope keeps postponing hard truths. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. Nothing here felt inevitable until it was already over. If you want more deep, carefully told stories that go beyond headlines and into the hidden layers behind public lives, stay with us. Some stories don't just inform you, they stay with you. Long after the investigation files are closed and the headlines stop circulating, this story will continue to echo for a very different reason. Not because of who Rob Reiner was, but because of what his ending revealed about the lives we think we understand. For decades, his work taught audiences how people connect, how conflict unfolds, how resolution is earned. His films were built on the belief that communication matters, that truth eventually surfaces, and that human bonds, no matter how strained, can still find meaning. That belief shaped entire generations of storytelling. But real life doesn't follow scripts. The final chapter of this story didn't arrive with structure or clarity. It arrived quietly, inside a house that offered no warning, no buildup, no clear moment where everything went wrong. And that's why it unsettles people so deeply. It forces the realization that understanding human nature doesn't grant immunity from it. This wasn't a failure of success. It wasn't a failure of love. It was a failure of resolution. Years of struggle, attempts at healing, moments of hope, all existing alongside damage that never fully surfaced until it was too late. The kind of damage that doesn't scream, the kind that waits. For viewers, this story lingers because it mirrors something uncomfortably familiar. Families everywhere carry unresolved tension, conversations postponed, pain managed instead of confronted. The assumption that time alone will soften everything. Most of the time it does. Sometimes it doesn't. That's the legacy this story leaves behind. Not a moral lesson, not a warning wrapped in certainty, but a reminder that appearances are fragile and silence is never neutral. What isn't addressed doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. The house still stands, the films still play, the causes he fought for still move forward, but the ending doesn't fit the life that came before it, and maybe it never will. And that unresolved feeling is what stays with people. Because some stories don't end to be understood, they end to be remembered. This is the part of the story that refuses to fade. Not because of police reports or court proceedings, but because of what it forces people to confront about their own lives. When a tragedy like this happens, the instinct is to search for a single breaking point, a moment where everything clearly went wrong. But this case offers no such relief. What makes it so disturbing is how ordinary everything looked right up until the end. The house didn't signal danger. The family didn't appear broken beyond repair. The life, from the outside, looked complete. And that illusion is exactly what stays with people. For decades, Rob Reiner told stories that helped audiences understand relationships, how misunderstandings grow, how silence damages bonds, how love can survive conflict if it's faced honestly. His films were built on the idea that communication changes outcomes, that confronting the truth, no matter how painful, is better than avoiding it. Yet his final chapter exposed the hardest truth of all. Knowing how stories work doesn't mean you can control how life unfolds. This wasn't a tragedy born from neglect or indifference. It came from effort, from years of trying, from cycles of hope, disappointment, and renewed belief that things would eventually stabilize. That's what makes it resonate so deeply. Many families live inside that same pattern, holding on just long enough to believe the worst has passed. And most of the time, it does. That's why this story is so unsettling. It's the exception people don't want to imagine. The reminder that unresolved pain doesn't always heal quietly. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it hardens, and sometimes it surfaces when no one expects it to. There's also the discomfort of proximity. This didn't happen in isolation or darkness. It didn't come from a stranger or an unknown threat. It came from within a family, within a space defined by trust. That reality challenges the comforting belief that danger is always external, always visible, always avoidable if you're careful enough. It isn't. The public reaction reflects that discomfort. People argue over politics, legacy, responsibility, and meaning because arguing creates distance. It turns a human collapse into an abstract debate. But strip all that away, and what remains is something far simpler and far heavier. A family that ran out of time to fix what hurt. The house in Brentwood still exists as a physical place, but symbolically it has become something else. A reminder that safety can be convincing, that calm can be misleading, that silence is not peace, it's just the absence of noise. And maybe that's why this story continues to pull people in. It doesn't offer closure, it doesn't resolve cleanly, it doesn't reassure. Instead, it leaves viewers sitting with an uncomfortable awareness that life doesn't always give warnings in the way we expect. Some endings don't arrive with chaos, they arrive with normalcy. And that realization stays with you long after the screen goes dark.